Hi, it's Paul Antonelli here. I'm welcome to another episode of the Ideal Business Podcast. This morning I find myself in a place called, it's just outside of Uluru. So I'm located about 100 k's outside of Uluru in the centre of Australia. And in the background you can see what they are, the Kata Chutcha, or they used to be referred to as the Olgas. They're 200, you can see them in the background. It's early morning, sun's sort of just rising. Thought it'd be a great spot to produce a bit of a podcast. Got a few different things. Today what I wanted to talk about was, it's been interesting. I've been on the road now for close to, in the last 12 months, about 10 months. And I do like this style of travelling, sort of locating, camping, remote camping type stuff. And as a function of that, I don't really, it's really interesting, I don't actually spend a lot of time around social media or watching the news, all that sort of stuff. What I've come to realise is, and look, I don't normally do that anyway, but what I've realised is that when you start looking at the media channels, the mainstream media, all the sort of news that comes down the line, it would give you the impression that the world's a disaster and it's about to implode. And so when you look back over recent history, say from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, right through, at every one of those periods, there was some mainstream monumental event that was going to be catastrophic and disastrous. And of course, so you've got these overlying major issues that are going to take place. And then on a day-to-day basis, there's all sorts of stuff that's in the media. But the one thing you'll notice about the media, and it's pretty much guaranteed, is that it's always doom and gloom. And I think it's because it sort of, obviously it attracts people's attention, but the doom and the gloom, the fear that gets created around it. And as we know, most of the things that get talked about never really eventuate. The most recent, I guess, phenomenon of that was the pandemic that we saw that unfolded, and now it's pretty much just, this is on the other side of it that I'm producing this podcast. It's pretty much back to normal, and it's pretty much getting treated like a flu, so I'm not quite sure what it was all about. And so what we're finding out now is that the media always has to have something else to latch onto. So the best thing, from my opinion, is to really avoid watching any form of TV or news that comes through the main channels. It really doesn't serve you well at all. And it is important, I think it's important to be kept up to date with what's happening, but you need to sort of get your news from different sources, and from sources that you believe still produce quality journalism. In Australia, there's a newspaper called the Australian Financial Review. I do subscribe to that, and I find it gives me really good information about what's going on in Australia. It's primarily a business type newspaper, but I do get news from that. There's less sensationalism, I guess, in print media because it's just, it's flat. You got to read it. You got to go through and sort of digest it, where opposed to videos or TVs where the news channels, the early morning shows, all these things, it's all about getting eyeballs onto channels. So I've really worked out, and there's probably a lot of you that may have done the same thing. And it's a recently I guess I would call it a more recent phenomenon, in the sense that, something happens on the other side of the globe, instantly, pretty much instantly, there's not even any lag at the moment. It tracks its way around the world so fast. And I guess what used to happen pre the way that news spreads nowadays is that something would happen and we'd get it and it would come and it'd be very remote. Now we're getting this live sort of, it's happening instantly. And so it's not, what tends to happen now is we We have all these issues that are going on, not only locally in our area, in our state, nationally, and now there's all these things going on globally. And I think it's definitely increased the level of fear and anxiety that people have, because the world's messy. There's nothing really standard about what goes on in the world. There's good people, there's bad people, there's always conflicts. We've had conflicts forever. There's always been issues. There's always something that's going on around the world. So my viewpoint is that I can't really affect what's going on in the rest of the world. And for me, knowing it and getting the information on it, and I'm not convinced that often the information that's fed to us is there to serve a particular purpose. Example is to get people to watch, get people to engage, get people to share information. And so that sort of creates a little bit of a bias on that basis. And so I don't really trust the news sources anyway. Typically whenever I hear about something, I always try to go back to source, like where did it originally come from, and see if it's actually true. And being able to discern information is becoming and is a very, very important skill to develop. And so social media, whether it's on social media, whether it's on the mainstream news, there's so much out there that's going on at the moment that it can become overwhelming. So the best way to tackle it is simply to don't engage with it at all. You'll find that your state of mind will be much better. The level of anxiety will be less. And what you'll focus and you'll put your attention on are the things that are important to you. So obviously operating and running a business in your local area, if that's where you are, what's happening maybe within the state or province you exist, or within your country. These are things that may have an impact on your business. If there's things overseas that are impacted on your business, it's good to be kept up abreast with it. But it's really important to get the news from source. Make sure that the information that's coming back to you and the data that you're collecting is actually correct, because as we know, it does get a little bit distorted through the various media channels that exist. And of course, it's not a surprise, and we all know now that the media channels are controlled by a handful of people, most of the large media channels, and they have bias, they have political bias, and they have the ability to affect and influence how we behave and how we see things, whether that's elections, which is a really good example, or just other issues. They have a huge impact. So you have to understand that that's what their mission is. It's not really there to provide unbiased news. I don't know when it stopped happening, but it's been a long time since mainstream media was all about providing unbiased news. So I think from a perspective of, when you're running and you're trying to build a business, you want to build an ideal business that really works and hums for you, your state of mind is actually really important. And staying focused on what's important, what's relevant, what can you affect, what's within your centers of, circles of influence, what can you have an impact on? There's so many things that happen globally that we have no ability to impact on. Getting the information, whether it affects us or not, everything's going, it may have some impact, but the reality is that more often than not, the impact, the scale of the impacts are always presented as the worst case negatives, always. And it's very sensational then, it gets people attracted, and it has the ability, and people talk. And so it's not really, there's no basis to it. And I think if you look at most countries, for example, the information, and I'll go back to the pandemic, the original forecasts around the number of deaths that were going to happen around the globe was astronomical if you go back and look at it. We never got near any of that. And in fact, what's become clearer now at the other end of that pandemic is, the number of deaths is pretty much equal to the number of people that died from the flu every year. So we haven't really seen globally more deaths than what would normally happen. So that's been really interesting. But when you look back at the beginning of this and how it was being presented, and of course there was a mission there. It was all about control, and there was a need getting people to comply with a whole bunch of requirements. And so using fear and the media to do that worked effectively, worked really, really well. So I'm lucky in a way that where I am now, where I'm producing, there's no signal. Most of the locations I travel, there's no signal. Certainly no access to mainstream media, which I don't really miss. Every now and then, if I stay in hotel accommodation, I'll click on the channel in the morning, and it really hits you how negative it is and how much fear is being peddled and how it's there really to create anxiety. And of course, you'll see this every time with the news channels. Right at the end, they have the good news story, which might be, if it's a 1 hour of news, or it's, it might be 2 or 3 minutes, they put some fluffy, happy story at the end. So for a good state of mind, because I'm pretty logical the way I look at it, doesn't impact on me most of the stuff that happens. And you often get into discussions with people that say, well, aren't you concerned about this? Don't you think it's important that this happens? Shouldn't we be doing more about that? Look, I get that. There's so many things. But the reality is we can't. And all that can happen with filtered exposure and stuff that's presented in a specific way, all that happens with that is it can affect your thinking, can create stress and anxiety. And at the end of the day, it probably won't have any impact on you, because that's just how it unfolds. So I think it's a good idea to if you are, you may be doing this already, just keep away from the news, keep away from the media. If you're not, and you do watch it, just try it and see what it does. Just actually cut it back and see what happens. Find your sources of information and news that you think are important for you to keep up to date with. I'd recommend that. Find those sorts of news channels, and but by and large, keep away from anything mainstream, because there's always some ulterior objective or reason that stuff's getting presented. And if you want to have a much more balanced, a happier life, have a better state of mind, and be better focused on your business and what you can get on and put your attention on, then I think it's a really good outcome. Thanks for listening to this Ideal Business podcast from the central deserts of Australia, and I look forward to catching up with you in another podcast. Ciao for now.